Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling cases ever recorded in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening. We want to know the places and hours when these stories reach you. In the fall of 1892, the secluded settlement of Black Hollow in the Missouri Ozarks became the backdrop for events that left even experienced investigators questioning everything they thought they understood. Hidden deep in the rough hills of Taney County, this isolated community of barely 40 people lived by rhythms older than the Civil War. The hollow stretched nearly 3 miles between steep limestone cliffs and could only be reached by a narrow path cutting through thick oak and hickory forests. Most of the families there had never traveled beyond the trading post in Forsyth, a dangerous 25-mile trek northeast that claimed lives every winter. Black Hollow was a natural fortress. Bull Creek wound its way along the valley floor, fed by clear springs bubbling out of limestone. The water was so pure that travelers would detour miles off their routes just to fill their jugs. But this same isolation meant people could vanish. Without notice, secrets could linger for generations, and the line between wilderness and civilization blurred into something unsettling. Long before settlers arrived, native tribes had made use of the hollow. Creek and Cherokee hunting parties camped in the caves and left behind pictographs and artifacts. To the settlers, these markings were both fascinating and disturbing. The images showed strange rituals and figures twisted into unnatural shapes, leaving people to wonder whether they were symbolic or records of something real. At the center of this community stood the Grimm family homestead, a weathered log cabin first built in 1847 by Heinrich Grimm, a German immigrant who came west with knowledge of farming folk medicine and European craft traditions. His cabin showed an advanced understanding of the land and climate, including features that locals would not adopt for another generation. By 1892, the farm was in the hands of his son Jacob Grimm, 43 years old, living there with his wife Martha and their children Samuel, 19, Rebecca, 17, young Heinrich, 12, and little Mary, 8. Jacob inherited more than land. He also kept his father's collection of books on botany, anatomy, and natural philosophy, rare for such a remote settlement and far more advanced than what most frontier families ever encountered. The Grimm family possessed more than books. Hidden in their cabin were handwritten journals and notebooks passed down through generations, filled with observations of plants, caves, and the shifting landscape of the Ozarks. These writings revealed a methodical curiosity that suggested the Grimms saw their mountain home not only as farmland, but as a place worthy of study and preservation. Martha Grimm, born Martha Schneider, came from a similar German immigrant family in the neighboring county. Her education was advanced for frontier life, giving her fluency in both German and English, solid knowledge of mathematics, and an impressive command of herbal medicine and food preservation. She married Jacob in 1870, and neighbors recalled their early years as unusually harmonious. Martha quickly earned respect for her sharp mind, her ability to heal wounds and sickness, and her almost supernatural talent for predicting weather changes. Their children were raised in a world that blended frontier survival with scholarly pursuit. Samuel, the eldest, excelled in hunting and tracking, yet also absorbed his father's books and notes, learning to read and write in 2 languages and mapping the region better than many seasoned settlers. Rebecca shared his intellect, but leaned toward botany, fascinated with the medicinal power of native plants. Young Heinrich was unusually sensitive to shifts in weather and animal patterns, while little Mary could find hidden springs and navigate the forest as if she carried an inner compass. The family's reputation in Black Hollow was complicated. Neighbors valued their knowledge, often turning to them in times of sickness or crop failure, yet unease lingered. People whispered about the Grimms' long hours, exploring caves others avoided, and about their uncanny grasp of the region's history and geography. That whisper turned to alarm on October 15th, 1892. Before dawn, 19-year-old Samuel set out to check the family's trap lines along Roar Creek, carrying his father's old percussion rifle, a canvas sack for game, and his leather-bound notebook where he recorded patterns in animal movement and weather. When night fell and Samuel had not returned, Jacob gathered neighbors, the Kellys, the Hoffmans, and the Mlouds families, who knew every ridge and hollow within 15 miles. Despite the dangers of the rough terrain after dark, the search began immediately. The searchers lit torches and lanterns and spread out in careful formation, covering every likely path Samuel might have taken. Before long, they found his rifle lying in the shallows of Roar Creek, the barrel submerged but intact, still loaded with the charge Jacob had prepared that morning. Nearby lay his canvas sack ripped open in a way that looked more like a knife cut than an accident. What disturbed them most was the absence of Samuel's notebook, the one item he never left behind, and which would have been valuable to anyone familiar with his meticulous observations. In the mud along the creek bank, tracks told a story no one could easily explain. Samuel's boot prints traced his movements along the water until the place where the rifle was found. But beside them were other impressions that baffled even the oldest woodsman. Thomas Kelly, who had tracked game in those mountains for half a century later, told the sheriff that the prints looked like bare feet, but longer and narrower than any human should have, with strangely extended toes. The depth suggested someone weighing over 200 pounds, yet the stride was short, as if belonging to a smaller person. Even more unsettling, other sets of tracks appeared nearby, some ordinary, some impossible to classify, arranged as if a gathering had taken place at the water's edge. Samuel's prints suggested he had walked into that meeting willingly, not dragged against his will. The search widened over the next 3 days, with men coming from Branson and Hollister to join. They discovered scraps of Samuel's clothing caught in thorn bushes nearly 2 miles from the creek, but the fabric showed no sign of tearing from violence, only the hurried passage of someone running through dense underbrush. The trail led toward the harshest ground in the region, where hunters seldom went, cliffs, shifting rock and cave systems that swallowed men whole. The last piece of his clothing turned up at the base of a sheer cliff nearly 100 feet high, in a spot no one could explain how he had reached. As the search dragged on, neighbors began to notice the strange composure of the Grimm family. Where most families in such a crisis collapsed in grief or desperation, the Grimms reacted with an unsettling calm that left volunteers whispering among themselves. Martha Grimm's behavior during the crisis unsettled nearly everyone who witnessed it. Where most mothers would have been overcome with grief or frantic with worry, she carried on her daily routine with almost mechanical calm. She cooked meals for the searchers, kept the house in order, and cared for her other children as though nothing extraordinary had happened. When asked directly about Samuel's disappearance, she spoke as if he had only been delayed, insisting he would return once his business was complete. What disturbed neighbors and volunteers most were her claims of contact with Samuel through dreams. She described conversations with her son in which he told her he was safe, that he was engaged in important work, and that he could not yet come home. At first, these claims were brushed off as the desperate imaginings of a grieving mother. Yet Martha's descriptions of locations and activities often proved eerily accurate. When Sheriff Henry Coulson arrived from Forsyth, he expected to handle another wilderness search or missing persons case, the kind he had managed many times in his 15 years as lawman. But Martha Grimm rattled even his seasoned instincts. Her answers were calm, consistent, and detailed, yet they painted a reality far removed from anything he could verify. She insisted Samuel had prepared for this absence, gathering supplies and knowledge for what she called a journey of discovery. His disappearance, she claimed, was no accident, but a deliberate step in continuing a legacy older than the settlement itself. Martha spoke of hidden knowledge preserved in the caves of Black Hollow wisdom, passed down through generations who truly understood the mountains. Samuel, she said, had been chosen to continue this work, his unusual sensitivity marking him as heir to secrets buried beneath the limestone. When Coulson pressed for specifics, her words only grew stranger. She spoke of communication networks that required no voice or signal of knowledge, transferred directly from mind to mind, of discoveries hidden in underground chambers untouched by sunlight. Interviews with the rest of the family only deepened his unease. Rebecca, the eldest daughter, confided that her brother had been plagued by disturbing dreams and visions since late August, images and impressions that seemed to grow more intense as the weeks drew closer to his disappearance. According to Rebecca, her brother had confessed to hearing voices in the deep woods. Voices that spoke to him with intimate knowledge of his life and family history. These unseen callers told Samuel of hidden chambers and winding passages within the cave systems, places absent from any known map. Soon he began venturing alone into the underground, returning with strange artifacts and specimens that he claimed proved earlier inhabitants once thrived there, people whose knowledge far surpassed that of the current settlers. Young Henrik added further details that disturbed investigators. He recalled his brother speaking in a language no one in the household understood, carrying on conversations with unseen companions. These were not the ramblings of madness, but structured exchanges. Samuel asked questions, paused, then seemed to receive precise answers about local history, advanced farming methods, and even medical practices unknown to frontier families. Henrik also remembered finding him standing still, in odd places at unusual hours, listening as though tuned to sounds beyond ordinary human hearing. More than once he followed his brother into the forest and watched in awe as Samuel moved with unerring purpose through terrain so treacherous that even seasoned hunters would have lost their way. When Sheriff Coulson turned his questions to Jacob Grimm, the father's answers unsettled him in an entirely different manner. Unlike Martha, who insisted Samuel's absence was purposeful, Jacob admitted his son's behavior had grown increasingly strange, though he dismissed it as the natural strain of life in isolation. But Jacob also revealed something the sheriff had not expected. The Grimm family, he said, held extensive written records about Black Hollow documents passed down through generations, filled with maps of cave systems, descriptions of artifacts, and detailed accounts of strange events in the region, spanning more than a century. When Coulson pressed to see these records, Jacob hesitated. His refusal was polite but firm. And though the sheriff suspected the papers might hold answers, he had no authority to compel the family to reveal them. Jacob defended his decision to withhold the family's records, insisting they were too fragile and too easily misinterpreted. If made public, he warned they would invite treasure hunters and vandals who might destroy sites of genuine historical importance. On October 19th, after 4 relentless days of searching with more than 30 volunteers, the effort to find Samuel was officially called off. The decision was a practical one. Resources were depleted, the terrain too dangerous, and further exploration would require expertise and equipment unavailable in the region. Sheriff Coulson filed a missing persons report and sent a request for federal assistance, though the remoteness of Black Hollow and the scant evidence made it unlikely that outside help would come. Jacob accepted the end of the official search with a calm stoicism that some admired, but many found unsettling. He thanked the volunteers, praised the thoroughness of their work, and then spoke of surrendering to God's will, as if his son's fate was not a tragedy, but a mystery destined to unfold in its own time. As the autumn shadows lengthened into winter, life in the Grimm household shifted with remarkable efficiency. Samuel's duties were reassigned among the family without hesitation, and the cabin's routines carried on with a steadiness that felt less like grief and more like preparation. What disturbed the neighbors most, however, was Martha. She began wandering alone into the very woods where Samuel had vanished, often gone for hours. When asked, she explained that the forest brought her peace, that her solitary walks allowed her to keep a spiritual bond with her missing son. Yet her movements raised questions. She traversed dangerous ground with startling confidence, as if she knew the location of hidden caves and passages unmarked on any map. More than one neighbor swore they had seen her appear in places, and at times that made no sense, covering distances in rough terrain faster than seemed humanly possible. To those who watched from the edges of the hollow, it seemed less like a grieving mother's search for comfort, and more like someone following a plan only she understood. More than one witness claimed to see Martha in different parts of the hollow at the same time, sparking rumors that she had secret accomplices or that frightened neighbors had simply mistaken her for someone else. Meanwhile, Rebecca, now the eldest child at home, took over many of her mother's duties. At just 17, she displayed a maturity that impressed some but unsettled others. The cheerful, curious girl who once dreamed of a life beyond Black Hollow now wore a haunted expression and spoke only when spoken to. She withdrew from social gatherings and community activities, her once bright enthusiasm replaced by a quiet heaviness. The change was most evident in her relationship with the land itself. Rebecca had once loved roaming the woods, collecting plants, and lending a hand with outdoor work. But after Samuel vanished, she refused to stray far from the cabin. Even short trips into the forest made her anxious, as if the wilderness itself had turned against her. Heinrich and little Mary revealed their own troubling changes. Heinrich's temper grew violent, lashing out at his sister or smashing household objects without warning, then collapsing into long periods of silence, where he seemed unreachable. At the same time, he began showing the same uncanny awareness of natural forces that Samuel once had, predicting storms and animal movements with eerie precision. Mary, only 8, changed even more dramatically. Once lively and curious, she grew quiet and withdrawn, often staring for hours through the cabin window toward the tree line. When she did speak, it was to describe conversations with Samuel, detailed exchanges she claimed were still ongoing. The winter of 1892 into 1893 was brutal. Heavy snows buried the Ozarks, isolating Black Hollow completely. Mountain passes closed, and contact with the outside world dwindled to the rarest of visits. Families survived on their preserved food, what god game they could trap, and whatever supplies they had stockpiled. It was in this frozen isolation that the most disturbing events within the grim household began. Just before Christmas, young Heinrich appeared at the Kelly home in a state of hysteria. He was nearly naked despite the bitter cold, his feet bloodied from running barefoot through snow more than a foot deep. His story tumbled out in broken, frantic bursts. But certain details were clear enough to chill his listeners. Something at the grim cabin had gone terribly wrong. Heinrich claimed his mother was no longer the woman he had known. She spent her days speaking in strange tongues no one in the family understood and performing tasks that seemed to have no practical purpose. What frightened him most, however, was his father's response. Jacob had grown so unsettled by Martha's behavior that he no longer slept beside her, instead retreating to the root cellar beneath the cabin. He came up only when necessary to feed the livestock or fetch firewood. And Heinrich described him as living in constant fear, convinced the figure in their home was not his wife, but an imposter, or worse, someone possessed. Alarmed, Thomas Kelly and his grown son William braved the heavy snow and followed Heinrich back to the grim homestead, though neither man could shake the dread of what they might find. The trek took more than an hour, and night was closing in when they reached the cabin. From outside, nothing seemed amiss. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the place looked peaceful. But once inside, the scene told a far darker story. The main room had been completely rearranged, Furniture was placed in odd positions without any practical sense, and everyday items once neatly stored were scattered in bizarre patterns as if following some cryptic order. Glass jars filled with herbs roots and strange liquids covered every flat surface, each labeled with markings the Kellys did not recognize. Bundles of dried plants hung in thick tangles from the rafters, filling the air with pungent scents that stung the nose. By the fire sat Martha Grimm in her rocker, though she was scarcely recognizable as the woman they had known for 2 decades. She was gaunt, her clothes sagging on a diminished frame. Her once carefully kept brown hair had grown wild and streaked with gray, making her look decades older. Most disturbing were her eyes, sharp, unyielding, and difficult to meet, and her face, which seemed subtly altered its features thinner and more angular than memory allowed. When she finally greeted Thomas and William, she spoke their names correctly, but the voice was different, carrying an odd cadence, as if English were no longer her native tongue. She answered questions about her family and Henrik's flight with factual precision, yet the words were delivered without warmth or maternal concern, as though she were recalling details from memory rather than speaking with any true human connection. What unsettled the Kellys most was Martha's insistence that Samuel was still present in the household. She spoke of recent conversations with her son, described tasks he had helped with, and even mentioned details of family life, as though he had never vanished. When the Kellys tried to remind her that Samuel had been missing for more than 2 months, she calmly told them their understanding was limited, that they did not grasp the true nature of human consciousness and communication. When asked about Jacob, she merely pointed to the floor. In the root cellar below, Thomas and William found the man they had once known as a strong, capable farmer reduced to a husk of himself, wrapped in blankets and crouched among sacks of potatoes and jars of preserves. Jacob looked years older than his age. His hair had turned completely white. His hands shook uncontrollably, and deep lines cut across his face as though he had aged a decade in the span of weeks. Rebecca had been lowering food and water down to him, with ropes keeping him alive in his underground retreat. His explanation was fragmented and desperate, but the fear behind his words was undeniable. He told them the woman upstairs was not his wife, but a replacement, something transformed, possessing knowledge and skills she had never studied. At night he claimed he heard her holding conversations with unseen companions, her voice rising and falling in strange languages while no visitors ever came to the door. Jacob described stumbling upon apparatus and jars filled with substances he could not identify, the trappings of experiments beyond his comprehension. He swore Martha now possessed awareness that reached far beyond the hollow. She knew events occurring miles away, spoke with authority about cave passages she had never explored, and carried on conversations with unseen entities as though they stood right before her. To Jacob, she was no longer human, and whatever had taken his wife's place terrified him beyond reason. The Kellys tried to offer help, urging both Jacob and Martha to accept support from the community, but neither showed any willingness to acknowledge that anything was wrong. To the visitors, it was clear the Grimm household had slipped into a reality apart from their own, a place where logic and reason no longer applied. Jacob refused to leave the root cellar, insisting it was the only place he could remain safe. Any attempt to interfere with Martha's activities, he warned, would bring consequences too terrible for him to explain. Martha herself dismissed the Kellys' alarm, claiming they simply misunderstood the nature of her work and responsibilities. Rebecca drifted like a shadow through the cabin, peering nervously around corners, but never engaging directly. When Thomas Kelly tried to speak with her, she bolted into hidden parts of the house as though she had been instructed to avoid outsiders. Even more unsettling was the absence of little Mary. Despite a careful search of the cabin and its surroundings, she was nowhere to be found. Martha's vague assurances that the child was safe and engaged in private activities offered no comfort, and when questioned alone, Jacob admitted he had not seen his youngest daughter for weeks. His worry for her was obvious, though he seemed too broken to act on it. Disturbed beyond measure, the Kellys persuaded Heinrich to leave with them. At their cabin, the boy was fed and warmed, and it was from him that they pieced together a chilling picture of what had been happening inside the grim household. His stories were so strange that even hardened frontiersmen struggled to believe them. According to Heinrich, his mother had changed slowly at first after Samuel's disappearance. But the transformation accelerated as winter deepened and isolation pressed down on the family. She spent long hours with the old family manuscripts, obsessing over sections that dealt with natural history, geology, and what the boy called underground knowledge. She began venturing alone into nearby caves, bringing back materials she carefully cataloged and stored, following procedures that seemed systematic, almost scientific. These daytime activities were strange enough, but what Heinrich saw at night unsettled him most. From his loft bed, he spied on his mother as she carried out secret work under the cover of darkness, movements and rituals that he could neither understand nor forget. Heinrich claimed that his mother often slipped out of the cabin long after the rest of the family was asleep, vanishing into the frozen darkness for hours at a time. Despite the brutal cold and treacherous winter terrain, she moved with an ease and certainty that suggested she knew every hidden path as though it were daylight. More disturbing still were the visitors. From the small loft window, Heinrich said he watched figures approach the homestead in the dead of night. They crossed the snow without leaving tracks, their movements silent and strange. They never spoke in the ordinary sense, yet seemed to communicate with Martha in some other fashion, holding wordless exchanges that lasted late into the night before they vanished as quietly as they came. His descriptions of these figures varied, but certain details remained consistent. They were tall and unnaturally thin, gliding more than walking, their clothing unsuited to the bitter weather. Yet they showed no discomfort in the freezing air. Heinrich insisted that they brought items for Martha, boxes, bundles, and strange containers that she later used in her experiments. He saw her store these objects in carefully marked spaces around the cabin and even in the root cellar areas, strictly reserved for her use. The Kellys found themselves trapped in a frontier dilemma. The sheriff was nearly 25 miles away in Forsyth, and the mountain passes were sealed with snow, making contact nearly impossible until spring. And what truly had they witnessed? A mother grieving in eccentric ways. A father broken by fear, a household that had turned inward under the weight of isolation. None of it could be called a crime. Even the spectral visitors might be explained as neighbors traveling by night to barter goods in secrecy. The unsettling changes in Martha's appearance could just as easily be laid at the feet of hardship and grief. After long debate, the Kellys agreed the matter required guidance beyond their own judgment. They resolved to wait for Reverend Isaiah Morris, the circuit preacher, who was due to ride through Black Hollow in mid-January. Reverend Morris had handled strange cases in remote settlements before, and carried both the spiritual authority and the practical experience to decide what ought to be done. Until then, the Kellys kept Heinrich under their roof, fed and safe, while watching the grim homestead from a cautious distance, uncertain whether they were looking at a family in crisis or at something far more dangerous. The Kellys also sent word to other families in the hollow, urging them to stay vigilant and prepared for emergencies should the situation at the grim homestead grow worse. The following weeks proved to be among the most unsettling in the memory of Black Hollow's oldest residents. The winter storms raged on, isolating the community and making travel nearly impossible. Yet strange reports began to circulate. Families spoke of lights moving through the forest at night, glowing orbs too steady and bright to be lanterns or torches. They traced deliberate paths between cave mouths and rocky outcrops, appearing on multiple nights and witnessed by different households, suggesting something systematic rather than chance. Soon came the sounds. In the hours just before dawn, voices echoed across the valley, carrying clearly through the frozen air. They spoke in tongues no one recognized, languages that seemed organized and deliberate, not the cries of animals nor the noise of wind in the trees. Some mornings the voices continued for hours, unsettling every soul who heard them. Thomas Kelly, seasoned in the ways of the woods, investigated as best he could. His judgment was clear. These were not animal calls, but human voices shaped by vocal cords. Yet they came from places no one could have reached in the dead of winter. Then there were the tracks. Snow should have revealed every movement in the hollow. But what residents discovered defied reason. Trails wound between cliffs and gulches, as if linking one cave to another, following routes that should have been impassable in such weather. Some prints showed bare feet pressed into the snow, impossibly large or oddly shaped, while others suggested footwear, unlike any boots or shoes used by settlers. Most disturbing were impressions that seemed to skim the surface of the snow itself, shallow, where they should have sunk deeply into the powder. By the time Reverend Isaiah Morris arrived on January 18, 1893, Black Hollow was a community on edge, its people torn between disbelief and dread. Morris was a veteran circuit preacher with 15 years of experience across Missouri and Arkansas, a man accustomed to hardship and the strange trials of isolated communities. Yet what awaited him in Black Hollow would test even his resolve. Reverend Morris was no stranger to hardship. He had counseled families broken by violence, soothed minds shattered by illness, and confronted the dangers of religious fanaticism more than once. Few things unsettled him, but he preferred to make his own judgments. After hearing the Kellys and other neighbors recount the situation, he insisted on conducting an independent inquiry before deciding what action to take. His first step was to sit down with young Heinrich. The boy was pale and shaken, but spoke with a clarity that Morris could not dismiss. His story was consistent, layered with detail, and deeply troubling. He described how his family had begun to change after Samuel's disappearance, subtle at first, then rapid as winter closed in. It was not just their behavior or appearance that shifted, but the very boundaries of what they seemed capable of. Martha, he said, had gained access to old records and documents hidden within the Grimm household. These writings contained maps of caves stretching far beyond what any settler had explored, along with descriptions of chambers carved with markings left by unknown hands. Some passages included instructions, rituals, or experiments that Martha had begun to follow, using herbs, roots, and minerals gathered from the land. Heinrich also described his mother's ability to communicate with unseen beings, carrying on conversations that lasted for hours and ranged from history to medicine to sciences. No frontier woman could have studied. These exchanges occurred during her long cave journeys, as well as during the secret nighttime meetings with the tall, silent visitors he spied from his loft. Morris then turned his attention to Jacob and Martha themselves. Jacob was nearly unreachable, withdrawn, and fearful, while Martha presented a challenge the Reverend had never encountered. She greeted him politely, even acknowledging his role as a spiritual authority. But her manner suggested she saw him as little more than an outsider to a larger design she alone understood. What unsettled Morris most was her knowledge. She spoke of events in distant communities, marriages, deaths, births, even minor disputes, occurrences she could not possibly have known without direct contact. Yet she recited them with accuracy and calm certainty. It was as if she had access to a network of information that stretched far beyond the hollow knowledge that should have been impossible for her to possess. What unsettled Reverend Morris most was Martha's command of knowledge that no settler or any ordinary person should have possessed. She spoke with confidence about Native American tribes who had lived in the region centuries before, recounting their customs and beliefs with a precision that suggested first-hand testimony rather than hearsay. She described their migrations rituals and eventual fate with details absent from any written record available in the county. Even more disturbing was her mastery of the cave systems beneath Black Hollow. She spoke of chambers and hidden corridors that no existing maps marked. Yet her descriptions were so precise that they could only have come from long, deliberate exploration work that would have taken years. When Morris pressed her for an explanation, Martha simply replied that her knowledge came from sources outside the boundaries of ordinary human learning. Jacob's interview proved equally troubling, though in a different way. Once known as a steady farmer and respected neighbor, he was now reduced to a trembling figure haunted by fear. He insisted the woman in his cabin was not truly his wife. Her voice, her mind, her very presence had changed into something unfamiliar. He described watching her perform experiments that required advanced knowledge of chemistry, medicine, and botany disciplines. She had never studied yet. She handled them with skill that would have impressed trained scholars. He also claimed she spoke regularly with unseen companions, engaging in technical discussions far beyond his understanding. Sometimes these conversations occurred in solitude, sometimes during the strange nighttime gatherings his son Hinrich had already described, all pointing to a network of contact that defied natural explanation. Jacob went further still, recounting changes in the land itself. Cave mouths near the homestead showed signs of modification, as though someone had recently reshaped them with tools far more advanced than any used by local farmers. Passages had been widened and new openings carved, forming a system of linked chambers that reached deeper beneath the hollow than anyone thought possible. Morris remained in Black Hollow several more days, consulting with neighbors and weighing what little authority he had. But the weather was relentless, and the Grimm family resisted all attempts at intervention. His final effort came on January 25, 1893, when he made the difficult trek back to the Grimm homestead with Thomas Kelly and 2 other community leaders. What they found exceeded even their darkest expectations. Fresh trails cut through the snow, linking the cabin to outbuildings and cave mouths, showing clear signs of recent activity. Yet the footprints themselves raised questions no one could answer. Some were ordinary enough, but others were elongated, misshapen, or so light upon the snow that they barely broke the surface. The tracks surrounding the cabin suggested that strangers had been visiting regularly, outsiders unknown to the hollow. Inside the transformation of the Grimm home was even more unsettling. The once simple living space had become something between a laboratory and a workshop. Its tables crowded with jars, measuring tools, and preserved specimens arranged according to patterns the visitors could not decipher. Martha herself looked worse than ever. Thin, pale, her frame wasted, despite the stores of food clearly available. Her manner was polite but cold, as though she were receiving unfamiliar guests rather than neighbors and a preacher who had known her for decades. She spoke calmly of duties and responsibilities that she claimed were vital not only to her family, but to the entire region, though none could make sense of her meaning. Jacob was nowhere to be found. Martha insisted he was safe and engaged in important work requiring privacy. Her assurances clashing with the memory of the terrified, broken man hiding in the cellar weeks before. Rebecca emerged briefly, and her condition shocked the visitors even more than her mother's transformation. The girl was gaunt, her eyes hollow with exhaustion, and she barely spoke, responding in whispers or gestures that revealed almost nothing. Mary remained absent, and Martha's vague promises that the child was well did nothing to quiet the fears rising in the men's hearts. Reverend Morris left Black Hollow on January 27, 1893, shaken by what he had seen. In his formal report to church authorities, he urged intervention from lawmen and medical professionals, though he admitted the weather and remoteness made it nearly impossible. His private journals, found only after his death years later, revealed a darker conclusion. There he confessed that what he had witnessed exceeded his understanding of human behavior, that the forces at work in the Grimm household seemed beyond the reach of prayer or law, and that what was happening in Black Hollow might require remedies outside the bounds of religion or reason. As February wore on, the snows began to loosen their grip on the Ozarks, the first signs of thaw breaking the winter's stranglehold. Travel became possible again, if only briefly. It was during one of these rare respites that the most terrifying chapter unfolded. On the morning of February 22nd, Rebecca Grimm staggered barefoot through the snow to the Kelly homestead. Her nightdress was torn and blood-stained, her face wild with terror. Barely able to speak, she gasped out fragments of a story too horrifying to ignore. She claimed she had been woken before dawn by sounds of violence in the cabin. When she crept to the main room, she saw her mother locked in a furious struggle with several figures. They were not neighbors, not men from the community, but the same mysterious visitors who had haunted the cabin through the long winter nights. What Rebecca described inside the cabin that night was unlike anything the community had heard before. The mysterious visitors, once quiet and deliberate in their dealings, had turned violent. Instead of the calm exchanges Hinrich had once witnessed, this encounter erupted in shouts, physical struggle, and desperate attempts to seize the materials Martha had been collecting. The most terrifying part of Rebecca's account, however, was her mother's response. In spite of her frail, wasted appearance, Martha fought with a strength that defied human limits. She struck with precision and fury, wielding weapons and techniques her daughter swore she could never have learned through ordinary means, forcing back multiple opponents at once. Though the intruders eventually fled, they carried away much of the equipment and specimens Martha had guarded so fiercely. What remained was worse still. Rebecca said that when the confrontation ended, her mother seemed to collapse into madness. Her eyes lost recognition, and in a haze of fear and fury, she turned on her own daughter, mistaking her for one of the raiders. Only by hurling herself into the snow and running half-numbed through the freezing darkness did Rebecca escape. At dawn, William Kelly assembled a rescue party: Thomas Kelly, Reverend Morris, and 3 other men from the Hollow. And together they forced their way through the snow to the Grimm homestead. What they found would burn itself into the history of the Ozarks. Outside the cabin, the ground was churned and stained the snow, marked by blood and the trampling of many feet. Yet the tracks leading away did not match the boots of any settler. Some prints were elongated, others impossibly shallow, as though their makers were too light to sink into the snow. Inside the home was a ruin. Furniture lay, shattered dishes, broken shelves, stripped bare. Martha's jars and manuscripts were gone or smashed, her careful order reduced to chaos. Strange symbols had been carved deep into the wooden walls, their patterns echoing the markings long whispered about in the nearby caves. In the root cellar they found Jacob Grimm. His body bore the unmistakable signs of extreme violence, so horrific that the physicians summoned from Forsyth refused to describe them in detail. His official report mentioned only that the wounds could not have been accidental or self-inflicted. But the greater horror was the absence of Martha and young Mary. No trace of them remained in the cabin or its surroundings. The search party followed the trail of prints as far as they could, only to see them vanish at the same rocky outcropping where Samuel's trail had ended months before. Sheriff Henry Coulson took charge of the official investigation, joined by deputies from Jefferson City and specialists in violent crime. Yet the isolation of the Hollow, the winter weather, and the bizarre nature of the evidence thwarted every effort. In the end, their findings were inconclusive. What truly happened to Martha and Mary Grimm, and what forces had taken root in Black Hollow, remained a mystery that no lawman or preacher could untangle. the investigation confirmed only a few facts. Jacob Grimm had been murdered, and Martha and Mary had vanished under circumstances that suggested either abduction or some form of voluntary disappearance. Beyond that, the evidence only deepened the mystery. The wreckage of the Grimm cabin revealed work of surprising sophistication. The jar's devices and half-destroyed instruments pointed to organized scientific research far beyond Martha Grimm's known education or resources. The carved symbols on the cabin walls matched markings in caves across the region, suggesting a broader network of activity involving people whose identities were never uncovered. Chemical analysis of the residues left in broken containers revealed compounds unknown in Missouri, some drawn from plants that grew only in faraway lands, others appearing to be synthetically produced with methods astonishing for the late 19th century. More unsettling still was the discovery of human remains in varying states of preservation, evidence that they had been incorporated into Martha's experimental work. The treatment of these remains reflected anatomical and chemical knowledge, advanced enough to confound even trained physicians of the time. The investigation closed in April 1893. Jacob's death was ruled a murder committed by unknown hands, while Martha and Mary were officially listed as missing. Warrants were issued for Martha's arrest in connection with her husband's killing, but no meaningful pursuit was possible. Rebecca was sent to live with distant relatives in Springfield, where she remained for the rest of her short life. Those who knew her afterward described her as permanently haunted. She rarely spoke of her family, and when she did, her memories came out fractured and contradictory. Doctors who examined her noted psychological scars that seemed deeper than grief alone, as if she had endured experiences that tore at the very fabric of her understanding of reality. She never fully integrated into ordinary society, struggling to form connections or live independently. In 1901, at just 25, Rebecca died of consumption. Yet even in her final illness, physicians noted strange characteristics in her condition that they could not fully explain. Relatives later discovered she had maintained correspondence with unknown individuals during her years in Springfield, receiving letters and packages she never shared with her caretakers. Even more chilling were reports that she had retained some of the abilities seen in her family, an uncanny awareness of distant events, an intuitive grasp of natural forces and scientific concepts she had never been taught. After her death, her personal belongings were examined in the hope of learning more about her past, or perhaps locating Martha and Mary. What they found only added to the enduring mystery of the Grimm family of Black Hollow. Among Rebecca's belongings were journals, letters, and strange artifacts that offered the clearest glimpse yet into the true scope of the Grimm family's secrets. These writings suggested that the story had not begun with Samuel's disappearance, nor even with Martha's descent into obsession, but much earlier. The Grimms, Rebecca revealed, had long been part of a hidden network of families scattered throughout the Ozarks, bound together by a shared purpose, preserving and expanding fragments of ancient knowledge they believed had been left behind by earlier civilizations. This clandestine circle exchanged discoveries through coded letters and secret gatherings, carefully hidden from the wider community. They cataloged artifacts found deep within the caves, traced markings left by unknown peoples, and experimented with methods for expanding perception beyond the limits of ordinary human senses. According to Rebecca's journals, Samuel's disappearance had not been an accident at all. It was a passage, a chosen step deeper into the hidden order. His sensitivity to the unseen forces of the Hollow had marked him as ready, and what appeared to the outside world as a vanishing was in fact his initiation into a new existence, apart from conventional life. Martha's transformation, Rebecca wrote, had been her attempt to follow, but not all within the network approved. Some factions believed she moved too fast, jeopardizing their secrecy. Others saw her as a threat to the balance of their work. The violent clash that shattered the grim homestead the night of blood fire and carved symbols was not random violence, but the result of this conflict. In the end, Martha chose to follow Samuel, rejecting her opponents and embracing the dangerous knowledge they sought to restrain. Mary's disappearance remained the most tragic piece of the puzzle, leaving only the question of whether she went willingly as a participant in her mother's journey, or unwillingly as a captive bound to her family's fate. Rebecca's notes contained even more. She left precise accounts of cave systems beneath black hollow maps marked with locations of artifacts, records, and preserved remains collected by generations of seekers. These underground vaults, she claimed, held proof of civilizations whose knowledge outstripped the modern world. Most chilling of all her writings suggested the work did not end with her family's ruin. Others within the network, scattered through the hills and valleys of the Ozarks, continued their exploration, their experiments, and their pursuit of the hidden truths buried in the stone beneath Black Hollow. Rebecca's papers went further than anyone expected. She named individuals, marked locations, and revealed coded methods of communication, evidence of a network far larger and more sophisticated than the community of Black Hollow had ever imagined. The discovery of her journals caught the attention of Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a professor of anthropology at Washington University, who had long studied Ozark folklore. Unlike others who dismissed such tales as superstition, Hartwell recognized that Rebecca's materials offered an unprecedented glimpse into an organized tradition of knowledge hidden in plain sight. Between 1901 and 1905, he led expeditions into the cave systems she had mapped, risking the hostility of those still guarding the secrets of the network. What he found was extraordinary. The caves bore signs of centuries of occupation, chambers expanded and reinforced with engineering techniques far beyond what rural settlers could have achieved, passageways deliberately cut to link vast underground complexes. Inside, Hartwell's team discovered caches of written manuscripts, preserved specimens, and scientific instruments carefully stored and maintained. The scope of the work rivaled that of established universities and laboratories. Yet it had been carried out in secret, hidden beneath the wilderness of the Ozarks. Chemical analysis of materials from these sites revealed compounds unknown to North America, substances that could not be traced through any known trade routes. Some bore signs of synthetic production, their methods of creation centuries ahead of the scientific knowledge commonly available in the 19th century. Even more remarkable were the written records. They described systematic studies of natural forces experiments to expand human perception and applications of knowledge that seemed to draw on traditions outside Western science altogether. The documents also recorded communication between groups scattered across the region, from the deep hills of Arkansas to the ridges of Kentucky and Tennessee. What emerged was a picture of an extensive, long-lived network that had preserved and developed advanced forms of knowledge beyond the reach of mainstream society. The writings even hinted at contact with peoples possessing cultural and technological sophistication, exceeding that of contemporary America, suggesting that the grim family of Black Hollow had been only one small branch of a far-reaching order whose true extent remained hidden. The evidence uncovered in the cave suggested that the Grimms were only a fragment of something much larger. Rebecca's journals hinted at contact with advanced peoples whose identity and whereabouts remained obscure, but whose knowledge had clearly shaped the foundation of the network's activities. Dr. Hartwell's teams found signs that these teachings had been applied for generations. Yet the most unsettling discoveries were not in the past, they were in the present. Freshly cut passageways, recently stored supplies, and maintained equipment revealed that the work was ongoing. The network had not died with the Grimm family. It had endured. Hartwell's attempts to make direct contact with active members failed, and may even have provoked stronger security measures. His final report, completed in 1905, documented the scale and sophistication of what he had uncovered, while conceding that its current objectives remained elusive. The university quietly classified his findings, concerned about panic and the safety risks posed by the caves. But copies circulated among federal authorities and select academic circles. This led to further investigations in the following decades, each one confirming and expanding upon Hartwell's conclusions. By the 1910s and 1920s, scattered reports indicated that the network was spreading into new territories, refining its communication systems and achieving breakthroughs that earlier generations had only hinted at. Some witnesses spoke of individuals with abilities that transcended normal human limits, heightened senses, resistance to cold and hunger, even communication without the aid of any known device. Federal agents began quiet surveillance programs, but the efforts met with little success. The network's secrecy, coupled with the remoteness of its strongholds, thwarted nearly every attempt at infiltration. The few investigators who claimed to have seen its operations firsthand reported things so strange that their accounts were often dismissed outright. They described vast underground chambers outfitted with technology far ahead of its time, individuals whose bodies and minds had been altered in ways that defied medical understanding, and communication with groups or entities whose origins were entirely unknown. By the 1930s and 1940s, activity seemed to recede into deeper secrecy, perhaps in response to government attention, or perhaps because global upheavals, the Depression, the war had forced the network to turn inward. Yet the whispers never ceased. Black Hollow and the fate of the Grimm family became only one thread in a tapestry of legends stretching across the Ozarks and beyond. For those who knew the stories, the caves were never just caves, and the lights that still flickered in the forests on certain winter nights were never just lanterns. They were reminders that the work had not ended, and perhaps never would. Though the network seemed to retreat deeper underground during the mid-20th century, reports of strange phenomena never fully disappeared. Hunters, hikers, and locals continued to speak of lights flickering in remote valleys, of voices carried across the ridges, and of signs of activity in places thought long abandoned. The advent of more advanced investigative methods after the Second World War renewed official interest, but attempts to access the old cave systems often ended in frustration. Sites once identified by earlier investigators were found collapsed, sealed, or deliberately erased, as if the network itself had taken steps to hide its presence. In 1965, Dr. Patricia Wells of the University of Missouri launched the most ambitious study since Hartwell's time. Drawing on newly declassified documents and modern archaeological tools, she pieced together evidence that the network had not only survived, but adapted. Decentralized, technologically advanced, and harder to trace than ever, it seemed to be preparing for something larger. Dr. Wells found references to long-term plans, preparations for future upheavals in human society and the natural environment. The network, it appeared, saw itself as guardian of knowledge and abilities, meant to outlast collapse, disruption, or even catastrophe. The implications of her research were so profound that her final report was immediately classified. Portions of her findings, however, filtered into government emergency planning and national security doctrine, a sign that federal authorities were taking the matter seriously. To this day, that report has never been made public. Nearly 130 years after the fall of the Grimm family, Black Hollow looks much the same as it did in the 1890s. The land is now protected wilderness, its caves and ridges closed off from development. Yet rumors persist. Hikers whisper of strange lights and unexplained sounds. Tracks appear in places no one should be walking. Sometimes hunters return from the woods with stories they can't explain. Official records remain sealed in archives, accessible only to a select few. while the story itself has faded into local lore, half legend, half forgotten history. For those who have studied the scattered evidence, though, Black Hollow was never just a frontier tragedy. It was a window into something systematic, sophisticated, and enduring. The journals, the symbols, the preserved remains, the networks that spanned states and generations, all point to an organization that survived crises, evaded detection, and still guards knowledge hidden beneath the limestone hills of the Ozarks. Whether it exists today in the same form or has evolved into something new, the persistence of the legend and the occasional reports that echo it suggest that the story of the Grimm family is not finished. The idea that such groups may still be active in the remote corners of America, pursuing goals beyond the reach of ordinary society, forces us to question the very limits of human potential. Were they preserving ancient wisdom? Chasing a dangerous kind of power? Or serving some purpose we cannot yet comprehend? The evidence does not provide a clear answer. What it does reveal is that the tragedy of Martha Grimm and her family was not simply an isolated frontier mystery. It was a window into forms of knowledge and organization that have endured for generations, hidden from public view. The Ozark Mountains still keep their secrets. The caves remain sealed, the archives locked away, but the fragments left behind suggest knowledge and capabilities that could shape the very future of humanity. Black Hollow reminds us that even in an age of satellites, global networks, and constant surveillance, there are still mysteries that escape the grasp of science and remain untouched by official history. Perhaps one day when society is ready, those caves will be opened and the truths buried within will finally be revealed. Until then, they wait in silence, just as Martha Grimm left them more than a century ago, repositories of knowledge that outpaced their time, preserved for generations, bold enough to uncover them. For now, the hollow is quiet, its secrets guarded by stone and shadow. But if you listen closely, the wind through the ancient trees still carries whispers, echoes of voices, knowledge and ambitions that once stretched far beyond the boundaries of their age.